Let me tell you about one of the most maddening, exasperating mornings I have had on this bench in a long, long time. And I have had some mornings. Believe me, I have seen the spectrum of human folly, the depths of deception, and the heights of sheer, unadulterated audacity. But every now and then, a file lands on my desk that doesn't just present a legal dispute. It presents a fundamental failure of character. It presents a human being who has decided that the truth is merely a suggestion, a flexible commodity that can be bent, shaped, and outright fabricated to suit their own convenience. After decades sitting in this chair, reviewing file after file, looking into the eyes of person after person, you develop a sense, a kind of instinct, a cold, hard radar that kicks in before the defendant even walks through the courtroom doors. It is a feeling in the air, something in the way the facts are arranged on that piece of paper, something in the sequence of events, something in the sheer, accumulating weight of a person's record that tells you, before a single word is spoken, that today is going to be one of those days. This was one of those days. His name was Mr. Miller. By the time he stood in front of me, I had already spent time with his file. I had read the incident report, the police statements, the sworn affidavits, and the evidence log. I knew the story. I knew the timeline. And frankly, what I was reading made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just the alleged crime. It was the narrative he had spun around it. It was a narrative so detached from reality, so blatantly calculated, that it made me want to look up from the bench just to see if the man had any shame left in him at all. This was not going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was not going to be a quick fine, a slap on the wrist, and a have a nice day. This was not a 5-minute hearing where we sort out the paperwork and everyone goes home. This was going to be one of those mornings where you look at a human being standing before you and you think, how do you sit there, look me in the eye, and expect me to believe this? Let me back up. Let me take you to the beginning, because this story deserves to be told in full. The file on my bench told a story of stolen property, a high-value item taken in broad daylight, and a defense that was, to put it lightly, absolutely absurd. I read the facts once, then I read them again, because sometimes you want to make sure you are seeing what you think you are seeing. You want to make sure you aren't misinterpreting the sheer magnitude of the delusion. I was seeing it. I was seeing the lie. And as I sat there, waiting for the doors to open, I knew that the truth was about to face a very, very hard day. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and there he was, Mr. Miller. He didn't walk in with the slumped shoulders of a man ashamed or the nervous energy of someone facing the consequences of their own bad judgment. No, he walked in with the swagger of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room. He was dressed in a crisp, expensive-looking suit, the kind of outfit that screams, I can afford better lawyers than you. He looked at the gallery, he looked at the bailiff, and then, with a level of confidence that bordered on the delusional, he looked at me. It was that specific type of look, the I'm untouchable energy that I have seen 1,000 times before. It's a mask, a performative shield meant to intimidate, to signal that the rules governing the rest of society simply don't apply to him. He took his seat at the defendant's table, crossing his legs and tapping his fingers against the wood, as if the entire proceeding were a minor inconvenience he was forced to endure while on his way to somewhere more important. But I was watching his eyes. I was watching the way he checked his watch, the way he adjusted his tie. He wasn't nervous about the truth. He was nervous about the performance. He had a story, a pre-rehearsed, meticulously crafted fairy tale, and he was just waiting for the green light to let it loose. The complainant, a soft-spoken woman who had clearly been through the ringer, sat at the plaintiff's table. She wasn't wearing an expensive suit. She didn't have the untouchable glow that Miller was trying to project. She looked like exactly what she was, a victim of a brazen, calculated theft. When she recounted the events, her voice shook not from dishonesty, but from the raw, ugly reality of having her property stolen and then being gaslit by the very person who took it. And then, Mr. Miller decided to speak. He didn't just deny the theft. He launched into an explanation so convoluted, so riddled with holes, and so utterly insulting to the intelligence of this court that the room went dead silent. He claimed with a straight face that the high-value vintage watch in question, a piece of history, a family heirloom, had been voluntarily gifted to him by the plaintiff. A gift in the middle of an argument, he claimed. She just handed it over because she wanted him to have it. I leaned forward. I had to make sure I heard him correctly. You are telling this court, under oath, that a woman you had a heated dispute with, a woman you had allegedly wronged, simply handed you an expensive, Irreplaceable heirloom as a gesture of goodwill? Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. That was the moment. That was the absurd lie I had anticipated. It wasn't just a lie. It was a gamble. He was betting everything on the idea that I wouldn't check the evidence log. He was betting that his confidence could rewrite the truth. He was wrong, and he was about to find out just how expensive that bet was going to be. A gift, Mr. Miller? A gift? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but it carried across the courtroom like a thunderclap. The absurdity of it was almost impressive if it wasn't so insulting. I looked at him, searching for any sign of a tremor, any flicker of hesitation, but he was committed. He was locked into this lie like it was his only lifeboat in a storm. You expect me to believe that after an argument, after a conflict, this woman, who is currently suing you for the return of her property, decided to hand you a high-value vintage timepiece out of the goodness of her heart? He nodded, cool as a cucumber. Yes, Your Honor. She was emotional. She wanted to reconcile. I turned to the plaintiff. Ma'am, did you hand this man your watch as a token of your affection? She looked at me, almost bewildered by the sheer audacity of his claim. Your Honor, that is a blatant lie. I haven't spoken to him civilly in months. I didn't give him that watch. He took it off my dresser while I was in the kitchen, and when I confronted him, he refused to return it. He threatened me. He told me if I called the police, he'd make sure I regretted it. The courtroom shifted. The air grew heavy with the weight of her sincerity compared to his polished, artificial veneer. I looked back at Mr. Miller. He wasn't looking at the plaintiff. He was looking at the ceiling, waiting for me to move on, waiting for the trap to spring or to bypass it. But he didn't realize that in this courtroom, the trap had already closed. I had the police report from the initial incident. I had the statements taken on the day of the theft. There was no mention of a gift. There was no mention of reconciliation. There was only the report of a man who felt entitled to property that didn't belong to him. Mr. Miller, I said, leaning forward until my face was only feet from his. Let's play a game. Let's play the truth game. I have the police report. I have the account of the officer who arrived at the scene. And nowhere in those documents does it say, Mr. Miller claims this was a gift. Why do you suppose you neglected to tell the responding officer that this watch was a gift at the time they were investigating the theft? Was it a surprise you were saving for me? He stammered. The confidence cracked. Just a hairline fracture at first, but it was there. I was confused, Your Honor. The officer was hostile. I didn't get a chance to explain. Confused, I snapped. You weren't confused, you were caught. And now you're backpedaling. I could see the sweat forming on his brow. The suit didn't look quite as crisp anymore. The performance was unraveling, thread by thread. He was no longer the smartest person in the room. He was just a man trying to outrun a lie that was rapidly catching up to him. I wasn't just hearing a defense. I was watching the collapse of a narrative. Mr. Miller, I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom silence like a razor. You are sitting there in a designer suit, expecting me to believe a story that wouldn't even hold up in a preschool classroom. Let's get down to the brass tacks. You claim this watch was a gift given to you in a moment of reconciliation, but the incident report, which is sitting right here in front of me, explicitly details a disturbance call where you refused to vacate the property. Not once, in all that commotion, did you mention a reconciliation gift to the officers on the scene? Are you honestly telling me you simply forgot that you had been handed a high-value vintage timepiece while the police were actively trying to remove you from the residence? He shifted in his chair, his posture losing that rigid, arrogant line he had maintained since he walked in. Your Honor, it was a chaotic situation. I was angry. I didn't think to bring it up. You were angry? You were so angry that you forgot you had just been given a fortune in jewelry? I leaned back in my chair, staring him down with the kind of look that has made grown men tremble. Mr. Miller, do not insult my intelligence. It is the one thing I do not tolerate. When you are confronted with a theft and you are faced with law enforcement, an innocent person says, "This is mine and here is my proof." They do not say, "I was too emotional to mention it." That is not a defense. That is a confession by omission. The plaintiff stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, he never reconciled with me. He forced his way into my home, grabbed the watch off my nightstand while I was in the kitchen, and when I caught him, he laughed in my face. He told me I was too old to wear it anyway. The courtroom went deathly quiet. That was the piece of the puzzle Mr. Miller hadn't accounted for. He had been so busy spinning his gift narrative that he forgot the victim wasn't just a bystander. She was a witness with a memory of exactly what he had said. I turned back to him. The game was effectively over. Mr. Miller, I have heard many stories in my time, but the forgotten gift is perhaps the most insulting I've encountered. You had one job here today, to provide a credible, factual defense. Instead, you have provided me with a masterclass in deception. You walked into this court thinking you could treat it like a stage for your creative writing, hoping to walk out with stolen property. You are profoundly mistaken. His face drained of color. The arrogance that had fueled his entry was replaced by the cold reality of a man cornered by his own hubris. He started to open his mouth, perhaps to try another lie, but I cut him off with a sharp wave of my hand. Don't bother. You've said quite enough. I watched him. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was the suffocating sound of a fabricated reality hitting a brick wall. Miller shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the exit like he was calculating the distance. He was looking for an escape, but in my courtroom, the only way out is through the truth. He tried to straighten his jacket, but the action looked pathetic, a remnant of a dignity he had surrendered the moment he decided to walk in here and lie to my face. Mr. Miller, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air, you have spent the last 10 minutes spinning a web so thin it wouldn't catch a fly, let alone convince a judge. You looked at that woman, you looked at this court, and you thought, I can bluff my way through this because I'm smarter than them. That is your fatal flaw. You aren't smart, you're just arrogant. And arrogance is a poor substitute for a defense. He opened his mouth to protest, a pathetic stutter escaping his lips. I raised a single finger, a gesture that signaled he had exhausted his allowance for noise. Silence. You've had your turn to be creative. Now, it is time for the reality. You took that watch. You knew it wasn't a gift. You knew it was hers. And you did it because you felt you were entitled to take whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted it, from whoever you pleased. You thought you could treat this courtroom like a stage for your own personal drama, thinking your charisma and your suit would act as a shield against the truth. I picked up the file one final time, the paper feeling heavy with the weight of his incompetence. It was time to end the charade. In this court, we don't operate on I forgot or I was confused. We operate on facts. And the facts here are as clear as day. You are liable for the full value of the property, plus the court fees for the utter waste of time you've forced upon us all. Do you understand the gravity of your situation, sir, or are you still confused? He slumped. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. The untouchable persona had completely dissolved, leaving behind only the man who had stolen a watch and gotten caught. He nodded, a small, barely perceptible movement. There was no more fight, no more lies, only the cold, hard realization that the game was over. I wasn't just sentencing him to pay. I was sentencing him to the reality he had tried so hard to avoid. Mr. Miller, look at me. You have spent the last half hour attempting to rewrite history in a place where facts are the only currency that holds any value. You walked into this courtroom with a suit that cost more than my first car, projecting an image of success and superiority, and you tried to leverage that image to make me look like a fool. You honestly believed that if you said the words with enough conviction, I would simply nod, take your side, and dismiss the case. That, sir, is not how justice works. That is how a con artist operates. And let me be perfectly clear, I am not in the business of facilitating cons. You claim this was a gift, a symbol of your reconciliation, but in the eyes of this court, it is stolen property. You do not get to dictate the terms of ownership based on your whims or your desperate need to explain away a crime. The plaintiff here has shown me receipts, she has shown me the original purchase documents, and she has shown me a level of integrity that you have clearly abandoned a long time ago. Your defense is an insult to the very concept of an argument. You didn't just fail to provide evidence, you provided a fairy tale. And the problem with fairy tales, Mr. Miller, is that they belong in books, not in a court of law. When you stood there and told me that she wanted you to have it, you were counting on the fact that you thought you were the smartest person in the room. You thought you could maneuver through the law like it was a suggestion box. You are mistaken. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You will pay her the full value of the watch, which is $4,000, and you will cover the court costs associated with this hearing. You will pay this immediately. I don't want to hear about payment plans. I don't want to hear about your financial difficulties, and I certainly don't want to hear another word about gifts. You had the audacity to steal from someone who trusted you, and then you had the double audacity to try and lie to a judge. You have no moral standing here. You have no case here. And quite frankly, you have no business ever thinking you are above the law. Do you understand the judgment of this court, Mr. Miller? It's not a request, it is an order. And if you have any lingering confusion about whether or not I am serious, I suggest you take a long, hard look at your reflection before you step outside those doors. Your arrogance brought you here, and now it is going to cost you $4,000. Consider it the most expensive lesson you have ever learned. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't care about his response. The look on his face, that pale, hollow realization that his game was over, was all the answer I needed. He had been stripped of his pretenses, and the truth had been laid bare for the entire room to see. The gavel didn't just end the hearing, it signaled the total collapse of Mr. Miller's carefully constructed reality. There was no magic loophole, no last-minute intervention, and certainly no miracle. Just the sound of wood striking wood, a final definitive punctuation mark on a story built entirely on falsehoods. He didn't look at the plaintiff, he didn't look at me, he just looked small. The man who had walked in with such an inflated sense of self-importance was now struggling to process the reality that he was, quite simply, wrong. As he stood up to leave, I saw the shift. The suit didn't fit the same way anymore. The arrogance, once his armor, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed. He wasn't a victim of a misunderstanding. He was a man who had gambled with his integrity and lost, and now the bill was coming due. I watched him walk toward the door, that quick, purposeful stride from earlier, replaced by a heavy, defeated shuffle. He wasn't the smartest person in the room anymore. He was just a man who had been humbled by the truth. This case, at its core, wasn't about a watch. It was about the audacity of someone who believed that the truth was a negotiable commodity. It was about the danger of living in a world where you believe your name, your clothes, or your bank account can act as a barrier against justice. But in this courtroom, those things mean nothing. Here, we peel back the layers of deception to find the simple, sometimes ugly, facts underneath. I hope he learned that when you stand before this bench, you aren't standing before a title or a name. You are standing before the cold, hard reality of your own actions. You can try to dress up a lie, you can try to articulate it with confidence, but the truth has a way of rising to the surface, and it is almost always more powerful than the most elaborate fabrication. Mr. Miller left my courtroom $4,000 poorer, but I hope, for his sake, he left a little bit wiser. Because if he walks out of here and continues to think that the world exists solely to serve his convenience, then he has a much harder lesson waiting for him down the road. And next time, it might not be a judge holding a gavel who teaches it to him. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind him, leaving a vacuum of silence where his arrogance used to be. Mr. Miller was gone, sent off to reconcile his debts, and hopefully to ponder the sheer fragility of the web he had woven. As I sat there, the bailiff brought in the next file, the rhythm of this bench continuing its relentless, measured beat. But for a moment, the room held on to the residue of that case. It's funny how a single hour, a single interaction, can peel back the layers of a person's entire life, exposing the rot underneath. You see, cases like this aren't just about $4,000 or a vintage watch. They are about the quiet, daily erosion of character. People ask me, "Judge, why are you so hard on them?" And I tell them the same thing, because the world is hard enough as it is. If you cannot be honest in a court of law, in front of a judge, with your own future on the line, where on earth are you being honest? Integrity is not something you turn on and off like a light switch when it suits your bank account. It is the steady foundation upon which a life is built. And when you decide, even once, to trade that foundation for a shortcut, you aren't just losing a case, you are losing a piece of your own soul. I think about the plaintiff. She walked out of here today with a sense of relief, not because the money is in her pocket, but because the truth was finally recognized. She had her reality validated. That, to me, is the true purpose of this bench. It's not just about settling debts. It's about restoring order to a narrative that someone else tried to hijack. It's about looking at someone who was wronged and saying, "The system saw you, the system heard you, and the system acted." In a world that often rewards the loudest liar, there is a profound, necessary comfort in seeing the truth prevail, no matter how much the liar tried to dress it up. As I prepare for the next file, I am reminded of the heavy, enduring weight of my oath. Every morning I put on this robe. I am not just a judge. I am a witness to the best and the worst of humanity. For every Miller who thinks he is untouchable because he wears a fancy suit and talks with a polished accent, There is a person like the plaintiff who reminds me why we do this, why we fight for the facts, why we demand accountability. Justice is not an abstract concept that lives in dusty law books. It is a living, breathing thing that happens right here, between two people who cannot agree on the truth. And my job, the job I have done for decades, is to be the one who decides where that truth lies. The gavel is down, the case is closed, but the lesson? I hope that stays with him long after the courtroom lights dim. Because if he walks out of here and continues to think that the world exists solely to serve his convenience, then he has a much harder lesson waiting for him down the road. And next time, it might not be a judge holding a gavel who teaches it to him. It might be life itself, and life is far less forgiving than I am. We are done here.